Hi, everyone. This is Stephanie with Knockout Productions, and I want to welcome everybody to the very first episode of Events Connect. I am so excited to be starting this series. We will be coming to you once a month, every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, to talk about different cultural connectivities so in the events industry. I've been having a lot of conversations recently with a lot of my colleagues in the events industry and events professionals around the US and around the globe about what it is to be culturally conscious. And I started thinking about, if I'm having these conversations and questions about different cultures and how people get together and interact effectively and well cross culturally, there's probably a lot of you out there who have these questions as well. And it begs the question, how can we create more inclusive and culturally conscious events? So I started this series, Events Connect, to have those conversations with people who are in the thick of it and right here for us to ask questions of and to and with, so that we can be better prepared to create better experiences for global audiences. So without further ado, I'm going to bring my first guest on to have one of these wonderfully culturally rich conversations. She's a dear friend of mine, and I'm so excited to have her with me today because she shares my passion for forward thinking and people-focused experiences. So she's one of my favorite people from the other side of the country. I'm on the East Coast. She is on the West Coast out in Vegas, and she is going to be a huge asset to our conversations. So everyone, please welcome my beautiful friend, Lilian Shen. Hi,
Hey,
Lilian.
Stephanie. So good
How
to
are
see you.
you? So good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited for these conversations. I know you and I have had several of these conversations before, and I'm so excited to get your take on some of these things. Before we jump into some of our conversations, for the people who don't know, give us a little bit of your background. What do you do in the industry? Where do you come from? Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. So I am Lilian Shen. I am the director of marketing for CORT events. So obviously, we provide furniture rentals for the events industry that stems anywhere from trade show to conferences, meetings, galas, set productions, whatever it may be, whatever you can think of. That's where we're at. So I run marketing for the brand. That includes all the strategy, including Stephanie, like you said, just being very people focused and making sure that we're doing the right things for our industry, whether that's, assisting our clients or the end user, or just helping to push forward initiatives to make us exactly what we're doing here, a more inclusive experience.
That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah.
And so tell me a little bit about how you got into the events industry. What's your background? Where did you start? How did you get where you are?
Yeah, so I actually started event planning back in college, and I was part of a sorority, and I immediately just took on, like, you know what? I'm really good at logistics and details. If you can hear my cat meowing, I'm so sorry. We might have a visitor at some point.
Maybe can be part of the
And
conversation too.
right? He's just like wandering around all over. So that's where it really kicked off. But my professional career actually steered a different direction. I was in consulting for a little bit. I worked at startups quite a bit. And when I was in the startup world, that's where, you wear so many hats and you do so many different things. And the event planning piece kind of came back into it. So ultimately, I was like, you know what? I need a little more consistency. And so I found my way to CORT events, and it kind of brought all those pieces together into one for me where, I get to work with design still, and I get to work with events. And it just all kind of came together in this beautiful, beautiful plate of love.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
Well, so Lillian, I know that you and I, like I said, we've had some of these conversations about culture, and we've talked a little bit about being people focused. So I want to ask you a couple of questions and dive into a conversation here about what it means to be culturally conscious and what culture means. So can you tell me, because I feel like a lot of the conversations that I've had, a lot of people have a different perspective of what culture means. So what does your definition of culture look like? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, definitely. So a little background, I was born overseas in Taiwan and I came to the States when I was 3.5. So even from the get go, it was just these two different spheres that I experienced. And so I would say culture to me is a culmination of our experiences, right? And it's not necessarily just geographical or whatever it may be, but it's what makes up your identity. And so the combinations are endless, and there's just not just one aspect to culture. It just, yeah, like I said, it's limitless.
Yeah, definitely. So, knowing that and knowing that you were born overseas, can you tell me a little bit about what and how you identify personally, what your personal culture would be?
Yeah, definitely. All over. So Taiwanese, so Asian American. I'm also LGBTQ. I also come from a low income background. I also have neurodivergence, which I recently heard a new phrase and I love it. And I've attached onto it is neurospicy.
I like that.
And I'm a trauma survivor. So I have a whole giant buffet of different things that kind of make up who I am and my experiences. And like you said in the beginning, we're both very people focused and people centric. And I think all of those experiences in my life is what makes me. And so my experience isn't just, my Taiwanese or my economic background or whatever. It's all of these things put into one person.
Yeah, that's awesome. And some of these things I didn't even know about you as you're saying these things, and we've talked a lot about each other and with each other about what we're doing in our lives. And so I think through these kinds of conversations we learn things about each other without even realizing that we didn't know them about each other. So and to me that's kind of what this project is about, is learning the things that we didn't know and weren't conscious of. So I'd love to, and again, having these conversations is a big deal for me, and I know for you as well. And I just love to hear a little bit about, in the conversations that you and I have had and all of that, what drew you to the idea of this project when I approached you with the idea of being on a show like this. What connected you with this conversation and this project?
Oh, girl, you know me. I love pushing the boundaries, right?
Yeah,
Like, for those of you who are watching who may not know me personally, the first thing I usually tell people is like nothing can offend me. Like it takes a lot, and you'll have like complete heads up before that point. So I love to push the boundaries. I love to just kind of break the mold of like political correctness and corporate culture and things like that. And you know, I love the platform that you're giving these conversations, because when we chatted about this before, there was this concern of like, I don't want to sound offensive when I ask certain things. And what's the intention? Right. And it's these questions that do need to be asked. And, so me, I like to push the boundaries, and yeah, I'm more than happy to chat about these things with you.
I love that. I'm so excited to have these conversations and push the envelope as far as what is okay to ask, what's okay to talk about, and things like saying you're a trauma survivor. That's even further than something that I would necessarily feel comfortable asking in an open situation, but you were gracious enough to offer that piece of information. So I think it's such a great opportunity for us to open these doors for those conversations. So I'm excited to keep going with this conversation. Speaking of pushing boundaries, I know that there's a lot of talk in the industry about obstacles and what the events industry as a whole is facing. Obviously, we are currently in the middle or amidst a very different life than we were facing 3 years ago. We are still at the hands of a global pandemic, the ups and downs of it. So obviously, that's a big major hurdle that our industry is facing. Um, what other hurdles or obstacles do you see that our industry is facing as some of the largest hurdles that we were needing to overcome?
Well, like you said, right? Like the pandemic is a hurdle on its own. But I think that opened up the door to these new avenues that we may not have considered before. So I think, uh, yes, it's an obstacle, but I think in a good way, if that makes sense. Because I mean, these past 2 years, you've just seen this explosion of adaptations to hybrid and virtual, right? And yes, that's like our way of survival. But if you think about it, it goes deeper because we're now being able to touch audiences that we may not have been able to reach before. And again, going back to the word culture, automatically, I think most people think geography, right? Oh, now we can reach international audiences. But even think about like economically, maybe some people weren't able to travel and now they have a method of being a part of this conversation.
Mhm.
Or even physical and ableness, like some folks may physically not be able to attend and now you're meeting them where they're at.
Right.
So now that's another obstacle, right? Is okay, now we can reach these folks and these different audiences. Is the content that I'm producing and the experience that I'm producing actually worthwhile to these different circles that I may not have considered before?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I think we've heard that phrase a couple of times from some other really powerful industry ladies, that let's meet each other where we're at. And I think that's a really powerful statement of, it's not about necessarily overcoming obstacles, but it's finding ways to meet people and bring what we're creating to anybody who's wanting that experience, and however they are wanting that experience. And how do we do that effectively for multitudes
Mhm.
of different types of people? Like you said, we've got people who can travel and people who can't. And how does that affect how we plan things? And uh, how does that get incorporated in our decision making as event professionals and event planners? So I think that's a really good way to start looking at things, rather than having to overcome an obstacle, having to create connections with people that we weren't necessarily creating those connections for before. I think that's
I
a,
love that.
yeah, I think um, I think you, like me, have the opinion of flipping things on their head sometimes and not looking at it from a difficulty standpoint, but an opportunity standpoint.
Yeah, and I mean, you know how it goes in our industry, right? We just plan and plan and plan, and we go and go and go. We're always on the move, and it kind of almost takes something earth-shattering like the pandemic, unfortunately, to stop us
Mhm.
and to rethink things, because that's what's actually going to stop us in our tracks and kind of shake us off that routine.
Yeah.
So in a way, yeah, I think we've learned so much in these past 2 years, more than I would say, the years before, where we're just kind of in that groove.
Yeah, it's definitely given us the opportunity to look at things in a different light,
Yeah.
albeit not one we would have relished or chosen to begin with. However, glass half full, silver linings. We have been given the opportunity to have these conversations now because we do, and
Yep.
it's in front of us now. So let's look at it from the other side of the lens a little bit. And coming from an attendee standpoint, I know you, like me, go to a lot of events and go to conferences and things like that. So coming from your personal culture, and we talked about this a little bit before, having those personal culture identifiers, when you walk into an event and you bring that experience and that lens with you, how does that play into your experience? What do you bring to your experience as an attendee, personally and culturally, that might not be that a planner might not be aware of, and how can we be more cognizant to that?
Yeah. So I moved to the States when I was 3.5. So I'm very like well immersed into American culture and kind of just how we interact with each other. But there is always this kind of like voice in the back of my head where I notice certain things. So it's even some things as simple as like handshakes.
Mm.
Like in a lot of Asian cultures, handshakes are really reserved for friends, and it's not something that you typically do upon meeting someone. So, if you're at a networking event, that may come off as, whoa, what are you doing?
Too
So
late.
as
Yeah.
exactly, yeah, it's something as simple as that. And I even think about like within the United States, right? So I used to work for this startup where we were based in New York, but I oversaw the Vegas operations and like sales and marketing here. And there's a point to this, I promise.
Okay.
The the headquarters were very insistent on having every contract signed, every line item for every little agreement, right? Whereas in Vegas, it's a lot more relationship based when it comes to especially like influencer marketing and things like that. So when it comes to attending events and, networking events, corporate meetings, things like that, Taiwanese culture is very much like word is bond.
Mm,
And so verbal agreements can be considered, all right, that's executed. We're just going to move ahead. Whereas in the US, it's kind of more like, okay, yeah, sure. Yes, but until I see it in writing, it's still in fluctuation.
right.
So kind of like, yeah, so kind of like understanding those nuances and, making sure you don't bite off more than you can chew by saying something, and being misinterpreted by the wrong, yeah. So even those little things can make or break someone's success at an event.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm certain that with Americans being so handshake friendly and hug friendly before the pandemic, this pandemic has probably opened some doors for that conversation of how do we greet people and how do other people greet us at the same time, and it might be a little more friendly for everyone now that we've had to take a hard look at what a handshake does for everyone. So
Yeah.
that's really interesting,
And
I think. Yeah.
no, you actually made me think of something else too. Yeah. So now, right? Like as we adjust out of through the
Mhm.
pandemic, how we've been seeing like the color coded wristbands.
Yeah.
Like I want to hug, elbow bump or please keep your distance.
Yeah.
I think about that even in terms of trauma. Like,
Sure.
there are yoga instructors who are certified specifically to teach trauma survivors because like there's less touching and certain movements are more precious. And so even offering that up outside of the pandemic may be life changing to someone who maybe they have experienced PTSD and they can't just kind of like be touched without warning, so
Mhm.
considering all of these scenarios can just make folks more comfortable and kind of let their guard down and truly immerse themselves in an experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart thought. And as we're talking about this, I'm thinking of all different communities that might benefit from something like that. Um, people with sensory um, sensitivities. So I know a lot of people who have hearing sensitivities, that certain frequencies or certain decibel levels, how loud something is, might be um, anxiety inducing or fear inducing. PTSD is a great one. Different lighting situations, things like that. So
Yes.
having some sort of signifier that says, I'm comfortable to X extent in certain circumstances. Like I'm great in a room of 50 people having a conversation, but I'm not great in a concert hall with a rock concert going on because it's going to make me uncomfortable. And that's why I'm not going to the big party at the end of the night tonight, but I'm okay sitting in education sessions today. Um,
Yeah.
just being able to understand people and having that easy way of saying, I'm here to be here, but I don't want to discuss it, but here's why I'm not doing this and here's what I'm comfortable doing, so that without having to go into that, why aren't you? um
You know oh, go ahead.
Please. No, no.
Oh, okay. So you made me think of something else too about lighting, right?
Mhm.
So recently I've noticed, Instagram, TikTok, the social media platforms now are actually giving an option to include a warning label. Hey, this video has intense lighting, whatever it may be. If you have sensitivities, you have to opt in to view it. And I think how many times do we go to an event or like an after party, like you said, where it's just like strobe lights everywhere, right? And
Yeah.
like, and we get no heads up.
Right.
So even like building some kind of disclaimer into the registration or, hey, if you experience these things, this may not be the ideal event for you. And we have these other opportunities for
Yeah,
you to still
absolutely.
engage.
Yeah, and it's interesting because for concerts, for movies, those warnings are necessary. If you think back to some of the DJ concerts that you've been to at the front, if you've been able to see it and pay attention to it, they all have the warning signs that say the use of strobe lights is in
Yes.
effect at this concert if you have an issue, or in theme parks and you go into a ride, if you get motion sick, if you have an issue with strobe lights, things like that, the warning signs are there and available, and we're used to seeing them in certain circumstances, but we haven't started using them in the events world. So maybe that's something to start looking at in saying, what things might be triggering or an issue for some of our attendees, and let's make sure that they're aware of them before they enter so that they can choose their experience.
Yeah, and you mentioned sensory sensitivities, and that made me think of, I don't know if you've heard of Enchant. It's like the Christmas.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, like the Christmas pop-up that's all around the country, right? So I
Yeah.
went to the one here in Vegas, and right when you walk in, there's a sign that says sensory rooms available. Reach out to one of our employees or staff, and they'll direct you to them. And I just thought, how freaking considerate, because it may not be strobe lights, but there are still a lot of Christmas lights, right? You
Right.
don't know what level of sensitivity, and it's like providing these opportunities for like decompression.
Mhm.
Because I have anxiety, and so I not necessarily sensory overload, but there are times where I'm like, I kind of just want to go sit and have peace and quiet and like mentally reset before I go back out.
Yeah.
And having that kind of like escape opportunity, I think
Mhm.
would, yeah, that's also a really cool concept to
Yeah.
bring into the industry too.
And I think that's smart. It's fair and smart to do things like that as well for people who may experience something that they weren't expecting as well.
Right.
I mean, if you have really high anxiety and you think to yourself, I'll be fine, but it turns out you're not, what do you do in that moment? And if there isn't an opportunity for you to be able to effectively step away from that, regroup, and make the decision whether you want to go back in and continue, or if you need to remove yourself completely from that situation, it could completely change your experience at an event like that. And to even have a small space or any sort of space that is like a safe space for people to be able to collect themselves and then make that decision for themselves, it makes sense. I mean, I would love to see that for people in that way, or something thereof, because I think it's definitely something to think about when we're all in such different places that we just don't know
Yeah.
how we're going to feel or what's going to happen to us at any given moment. That I may have never had an experience of an anxiety attack before, but something triggers it, and I'm in the middle of a crowd of, hopefully someday again, 5,000 people. And exactly. Hopefully that is a scenario that we can get back to. But yeah, I think it would be great to have that space and that comfort, knowing that if I do have that moment, there's a plan in place for me by people who are giving me this opportunity to be there and experience this. So without having to
Yeah.
put myself completely outside of the experience itself.
Exactly. And, at the beginning you said, if you find yourself in a high anxiety moment. So for someone like me who has anxiety, um, if we experience that at one point, every single similar event after that, we're already heading into it with anxiety. We're already going into it knowing, oh, there's probably going to be the same scenario again. And I need to just mentally prepare myself. And like we always talk about, like, how do we create the ideal attendee experience? And that should never be, you should have to you shouldn't have to adjust for that before you even set foot at the event
Right.
or log on to the event, whatever. Same.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just really, like we said at the beginning, meeting people where they are and just kind of taking us out of that scope. We talked about this a little bit like before too, where um like in classroom settings, right?
Mhm.
Like back in the day, it was all about extroversion was what was rewarded. You get, the kid who raises their hand the most and speaks up the most and interacts with the most. gets the gold star.
Right.
Whereas the kids who kind of like are shy or introverted don't get as noticed, or, get reprimanded for it potentially even. And
Right.
yeah, and then now in the classroom setting, I've definitely seen that change, but it's still kind of that same concept isn't necessarily adapted fully into the events world yet. We're still rewarding the people who, want to go out and engage until 2 a.m. and,
Right.
party and network, et cetera. But there aren't as many smaller, intimate settings for
Mhm.
those who may, like you said, I'm comfortable being in an education session, but I may not want to be in this environment later on. And you don't want people to feel like they're missing out on that opportunity. So,
Yeah,
what's that balance?
definitely. And I think
Yeah.
to that end as well, it's a situation where we have those same people who are willing to do these things and go out and be extroverted in their experiences are also the ones who are willing to reach out and say, this is what I enjoyed, this is what I didn't enjoy. They're the ones who are willing to speak up and give their feedback.
Hmm.
And not that introverts aren't willing to give feedback, but I think they are probably um, less prepared to be the first one to make that move and say, I would love to do this if XYZ were the case. So rather than only planning for the people who are saying, this is what I want because I was here on this year, this is what I want to see next year, what is the plan for the people who didn't come because they didn't feel super comfortable saying what they wanted or being extroverted? And how can we reach out to those communities and say, we'd love to see you here. Is this something that you would be interested in being a part of? And how can we make this a great experience for you, even though you are not the 2 a.m.er, or you're not the concert goer? How do we make this a successful event for you to experience as well? And I
That is
think,
such a good point.
yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, I just think the the outreach needs to go both ways, I think. And
Yes. Yeah. Cause like we always do attendee surveys for, oh, these people are thinking of attending. What will make them happy? Right. But I don't think we ever really think about, I mean, we do. We survey like, why are you not attending the event? But it's usually things like, the cost, conflicts of dates, things. It's like tactical things, and not necessarily things that go beyond into like the person
Mhm.
themselves. And
Yeah,
I think that's a gap that could be filled, and that could be like the next, learning curve and step towards this more
yeah,
inclusive event.
yeah. I would love to see those conversations, and I'm a data nerd, so I would love to see the metrics on that and just how many people aren't attending events because they don't feel like they're being catered to in a way that makes them comfortable, not because they, of course, finances and logistics are always something that could be a barrier for people, but I don't feel comfortable doing this because I don't feel like I can be part of the conversation is a huge issue that I, as a planner, would love to know that before going into the planning process to say, well, what makes you uncomfortable and how can we fix that? Because we want you to be comfortable at our events. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting conversation to explore and what can we do in that manner as well. Um, I'd love to know, in sort of along that same lines, um, has there ever been a time, and obviously being conscious of the people that we know and the things that we've done, um, has there ever been a moment at an event where you, because of something personally and your personal culture, you have experienced the event negatively, and what was that and what triggered that for you?
I would say going back to that, the opportunity to escape. I
Mm,
think I think es- I would say now we're making more adjustments to build in blocks because we're also accustomed to working from home now and kind of like doing things on our own schedule, right? So now I think it's like the intention is, oh, we're going to mirror these folks' experiences at home. But before that, it was, let's say a conference would be packed, right? Like session, networking lunch, more sessions, right? And it's just
sure.
nonstop.
Yeah.
And for someone like me, like I can't do marathons like that. I have to do spurts and have decompression and spurts and decompression. And so then I would find myself, halfway through the first day and I'm burned out. And I'm like, I mentally can't reset because there's not an opportunity to. And it just felt like I didn't get what I wanted out of it. It's like what we said before, right? Like going into an event with anxiety, like day 2 was like, oh God, like, it's already going to
Yeah.
be a lot. And your brain just kind of already shuts down a little bit because you're
Yeah.
like, okay, this isn't, it was kind of painful for me yesterday, but I'm going to go back and, keep absorbing. But being able to build in those opportunities to reset and
Mhm.
process, I mean, not only for people like me, but also even just productivity. You want folks to have that time to reflect after each session and actually think about what they learned before running straight into the next program. And
Yeah.
of course, I'm speaking directly to conferences and things like that. But yeah, that's the first example that I can think of.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. Um, let's switch back to the planning side of things a little bit and
Yeah.
talk a little bit about what you think all of this conversation um, amounts to. So, in all of this conversation, what would your hope for event professionals be for their to take away from this? And what is that? What is the importance of being culturally aware as an event professional to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing process, right? And like you're doing now, and this is why I love the concept of this series so much, is it's having the conversations and it's going into it with the right intentions. And I thought of this recently too as I was, planning for this, preparing for this chat, is if you think about it like, okay, in the US, right, our unlucky number is 13. So you'll see programs, you'll see table numbers where they purposely skip over 13. But then you think about, okay, for me in Asian cultures, 4 is actually an unlucky number. So so are you approaching it in that, are you going to research every offensive number and
Right.
make sure you accommodate, that for everyone and of different spheres? Or are you just sticking with what we know locally?
Right.
Or do you choose, and this is the alternative, to just ignore that and just go 1 through 30, right? So that's kind of my analogy for like just being conscientious of every decision, whether it's saying I'm not going to try to please anyone or I'm going to try to please everyone, but it has to be a conscious decision as you're having these conversations. And yeah, like we said, right? Like it's not just asking what makes you want to attend, but what makes you not want to attend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that too because I think I've had rants and raves to you about the is it a all or nothing sort of situation. You can't there's no way we as planners can plan for every contingency. There's just no way. Or every culture or every person, every want, every need. It's just physically impossible to do that. But then on the flip side is that we don't plan for anyone. We just do what we're going to do, and that's that. Both of them feel sort of sticky, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Both sides, both extreme sides of that feel kind of sticky, and not like you're being reasonable, right? So that both of
Right.
those conversations feel unreasonable, especially when you're trying to be conscious of different backgrounds and people and sensibilities. But where is that decision along that line? Because it's a long line and there are so many decisions you can make along it. But where does that decision fall? And I think you just nailed that. As long as it's a conscious decision that is made with research backed understanding, and we say this is where we're going and this is what we're doing and this is how we're moving forward with it. Once you've made that decision, to really be solid on that decision, and that's how to move forward. And I think that's a really good point to make is it's not one or the other, it's somewhere in between. And once you found that sweet spot for you and that event, and I think the other thing to say there is it changes for every event, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's never going to be the same for any event, even for the same client year to year. It's always going to change a little bit, a lot of bit. You know,
Yeah.
it's going to be, it's definitely going to be on that continuum. And I think, um, listening to you and your perspective, I think some of my perspective has shifted towards the, um, you have to just be conscious of the decisions you're making to be effective with them. And I think as
Yes.
long as we're continuing to have these conversations and moving that point on our line in conjunction with these conversations and the things that we're learning, we can be more decisive and conscious about those decisions and in any way that we're going to go. So I think that's it's a really good thought to put into that. So, and I know there you and I have waxed on and on about all of these types of things, and I feel like I'm missing a key piece. I know that you and I are very passionate about this topic. I want to give you an opportunity to bring to the forefront anything that you have been seeing in our industry, trends, thoughts, passions, conversations. What have you been hearing, seeing, and talking about outside of our conversation?
Yeah. So recently, actually, I did a podcast takeover with David Adler on Gather Geeks, and we chatted with some of our industry friends just on, these design experts on how they're perceiving, how they're approaching event design and things like that. And one thing that came up that ties into our conversation right now, I think, is the choice, like giving attendees the choice to go different routes. So, the choice to be a 2 a.m.er or the choice to go decompress after every session. But the other piece that I was thinking as we're talking, is how do people learn and how do people absorb? You have audio learners, you have visual, kinetic, whatever.
Mhm.
So, like, I always think about, like, when I go to a conference, I'm just using conferences because it's the most vivid memory in my head.
We go to a lot of
I,
them.
I know, right? So I imagine, like, I think of when I go to a conference and sometimes, there's no visuals and it's just someone talking for an hour. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm a visual learner and I can't remember like the last three words this person said. But then when it's on a screen and there are graphics and I'm like, oh, easy, absorbed, right?
Mhm.
And then you have like the kinetic learners that like have to jot notes down.
Yeah.
So, like, going back to that concept of choice, it could be as simple as like, well, let me rewind. If you go to each seat and you drop a packet, like a workbook, like maybe two people are going to fill that out, right? But if you set it at the beginning and you kind of let people have that choice of opting into the workbook, then
Mhm.
it's much more likely to be utilized. And it's not like you're just kind of forcing this method on
Yeah.
everyone. So again, it's that conscious choice. And, it's even empowering the attendees to make these conscious choices for themselves.
Yeah, sort of like a choose your own adventure sort of situation, but it's a create your own experience. It's
Hmm.
giving our attendees the active role in their own experience. I think is
Yeah.
a really good way to not only create a sense of welcoming and a sense of belonging and a comfort for all of our attendees, but I think that's also a really good thought to create engagement for our attendees as well. It would stand to reason that, in that circumstance, if an attendee feels like they are part of their own building their own experience, they're going to be more engaged with the content that's being brought to them, with the experiences that are being brought to them. And likely they will be more engaged with the conference and the event and the client's company going forward after the event as well, if the attendee has felt engaged. So I think that's a really great thought to be able to bring not only consciousness of the attendee and how they're experiencing things, but also how to create engagement and how to create further engagement for the client's brand post event as well. So it's not just a one trick pony here. I think we're talking
Hmm.
about these conversations open up all sorts of opportunities for conversations and benefits beyond the attendees' comfort, which obviously is the major topic here, and how we make that a better situation for our attendees. But I think for clients, for our clients listening to something like this is, okay, yeah, but how do we then benefit from this? Not only do you have attendees who are excited about your event and will come back time and time again if they feel good and have had a great experience, but they're going to talk about your brand afterwards too. So I think it becomes an all-encompassing conversation of, this can only make everyone's experience better if we have these conversations and learn more about each other.
It really does. And if you think about, like, you know, for our clients, right, how to leave that lasting impression, the go-to tends to usually be like, oh, let's give them a personalized experience, let's give them a gift box or something to take away. But if you think about it, all of these little nuances are personalized touches. It's just not in the traditional, gift giving or um, run a show type of way, but it's still meeting them where they're at and doing little things to make sure their experiences, and you're creating that lasting impression. And that's what really makes it separates you from the crowd. If you're willing to just kind of, granted, I know it's a lot more work than just going with routine, but that's what's going to separate events from, one another moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. It may not be, name personalized, but it might feel that way to someone when they feel seen, or they feel like
Mhm.
they have been heard in their feedback, or that they're having an experience that they haven't had anywhere else because nobody else is thinking to include these things. So it's personalization on a different level, I think. I think you're right there for
Yeah.
sure. Well, before we wrap up, I again am so thankful to have had this conversation with you. And I think we've had so many great thoughts and ideas. And obviously, you and I will continue this conversation going into the future. And I hope those who are watching us today will also create their own conversations surrounding some of these topics as well. But before we do our wrap up, I would love to just hear any key takeaways that you might want to impart on some of our fellow event professionals here today.
Yeah. Have these conversations. Ask the uncomfortable questions, because the more we do it, like Stephanie, like exactly like what you're doing, the more comfortable it's going to become over time, and the more natural it's going to be. We really are just a hodgepodge of different experiences. And I think, philosophically speaking, approaching things with that like veil of ignorance and just kind of going in blind is what allows you to be more open-minded. And that's where that growth comes, and that's where that elevation of your brand and experiences come from. So yeah, let those defenses down, ask the weird questions, obviously go in with good intentions, and just be willing to learn. And I think that's just going to take us all to the next level together.
Awesome. Well, Lilian, I want to thank you again so much for being part of my very first episode of Events Connect. And I'm so excited to continue these conversations and keep going and creating more opportunity for open conversations within and around the events industry about cultural awareness and cultural consciousness. So thank you for all of your insights. And I want to also announce here that we will be doing office hours in conjunction with Events Connect. Every other week, we will be doing an episode, and on the other weeks, we will be doing office hours. So we will create a space for you guys to actually join in on the conversation. We'll invite our guests from each episode back to have a conversation with us. It will be in a more town hall forum situation, similar to Zoom, and you guys can jump in and ask questions and have conversations with us to continue our learning journey and creating better events. So please keep an eye out for the announcements for the office hours. Make sure that you are putting us on your watch list. We will be here in in your LinkedIn feeds every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, and we cannot wait to continue the conversations with all of you as well. Please make sure to grab a few minutes over on LinkedIn and any other platforms you might be watching us on. Give us a shout, ask questions in the comments, like, subscribe, all of those types of things as well, because we definitely want to hear from you and what you want to know. We want everyone to be part of these conversations. So engage with us as we engage with you, and we will be talking to you all soon. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you all very soon. Thanks all.